Hello, these are flipped notes 8-3 of clinical psychology, and we're talking about dissociative disorders, somatoform disorders, and personality disorders. Probably the ones you're least familiar with, and really that's probably just because these show up the least in movies and TV. But let's get to it. So when we say dissociate or dissociation, we mean the opposite of association. So with association, you are attached to, you're part of something, you're part of a group. With dissociation, there's a separation from reality. And we all do this in a milder sense when we're daydreaming, we get lost in the moment. But with dissociative disorders, there's a critical dissociation with different parts of the personality, can show up as memory loss, changing in consciousness or identity when those parts of the mind normally are working together. Sometimes dissociation happens if you're driving in the car and you don't recall driving through an entire town or the last 15 minutes of driving because it was real familiar or a common route. That could have been a dissociating moment as well. We've got three specific ones that we look at in this section. And the first is probably the most well-known because this one does tend to show up in media, though very inaccurately portrayed. And that's dissociative identity disorder, or DID, which was previously known as multiple personality disorder. In this, a person appears to have two or more distinct personalities. Sometimes they can speak, act, write in different ways. Sometimes they even show up as different genders. Sometimes they seem to have their own memories, their own wishes and impulses. Sometimes there's conflict between the different identities. Problems occur because they only have one body that they share, and only one personality can usually be out at a time. For the person, they look or they appear to be very inconsistent because the strong personalities are trying to take over at one time or another. Dissociative amnesia is an extension of that. With dissociative amnesia, a person has memory loss with no biological explanation. So this is really a type of repression or selective forgetting, where they may blot out painful experiences, they're repressing it into their unconscious. So while DID is not fully accepted by the academic psychology community, dissociative amnesia is a little bit more recognized, especially in the terms of when people suffer trauma and they can't recall what's happened. Total amnesia is pretty rare, but memory loss for specific events in short spans of time does seem more common. Dissociative fugue is an extension of dissociative amnesia, and this is where they have amnesia, but then they seem to kind of wander off. They may establish a new identity, and not recall who they were or where they came from. They've repressed past knowledge. Dissociative fugues could last anywhere from just days to decades. Nowadays, not as common for them to last for a long time because with the internet, when somebody gets lost, the word can kind of be put out a little bit more easily to find them. Sometimes this is called traveling amnesia. The causes of DID and the other dissociative disorders, our psychoanalytic perspective would say that there's definitely some massive repression of unwanted impulses and memories going on, so much so to the point that with DID, they're creating an entirely new person who can act out the otherwise unacceptable feelings and who can also bear the unbearable memories. Behaviorist perspective will say that they have learned it, that the symptoms have been strengthened by kind of the reward of the memory loss of not having to cope with those stressful situations. The true causes, though, are pretty hard to decipher just because it's very rare. Most clinicians believe that for those who do exhibit symptoms of dissociative disorders, the root cause is some sort of abuse or trauma during childhood, that their mind separated themselves from the abuse as a way to deal with the situation, and then that continued throughout the rest of their lives. Like I said earlier, there are many in the academic community who don't believe that DID is an actual disorder, that people who have it are maybe a con artist or they're doing some type of role playing in order to ease their anxieties. I haven't found a more current statistic, but in 1999, about 25% of American psychiatrists believed in DID, so quite a few who did not. Our next category are somatic symptom disorders. I don't know how to make that go away. Okay. Somatic symptom disorders I've always called these somatoform disorders, but recently, I think it's in the DSM-5, they changed the name to somatic symptom disorders. In all of these, they seem to have physical symptoms that seem to suggest that there's a physical disorder, but there's no actual physical cause, like temporary paralysis, even though there's no damage to the spinal cord. So there's evidence instead that suggests that they're linked to psychological factors. And we have two main ones here: conversion disorder and illness anxiety disorder. In a conversion disorder, I think I actually have these out of order. There we go. A person converts their psychological or emotional distress into physical symptoms, usually to avoid dealing with a painful or stressful situation. Sometimes they call this functional neurological symptom disorder. That's a newer name. Usually, in the older terms, we've always said conversion disorder. But usually happens with the onset of a stressful event. As I said, there's no medical explanation. Sometimes it takes the form of paralysis. They wake up and they just can't get out of bed. Blindness, which to me is very hard to understand, like how you can feel blind but not actually be blind. But I've not experienced this. Deafness. In some cases, there have been seizure disorders, difficulty walking. And then one more well-known one is what they call glove anesthesia, where they can't feel their hand, but it's actually anatomically impossible the way they experience it, because they can still feel the rest of their arm, yet they can't feel their hand. But the way the nerves are working in your hand, if your hand, you can feel your hand, the nerves run all the way up your arm. So you should be able to feel the rest of your arm as well. One of the other significant indicators of conversion disorder is called lebel indifference, or beautiful indifference. And one of the strange things is that if you or I woke up and you were paralyzed, we'd probably freak out. You'd think, oh my gosh, I need help. But a person who has a conversion disorder, they let concerns like, oh, I guess I don't have to go to school today because I'm paralyzed. That's not a normal response. That's a response as a conversion disorder. Other symptoms allow them to escape from current frustrating situations. Sometimes there's some kind of secondary gain, like getting special attention or treatment because of a disorder. Now, one of the things to note here is that the person is not doing this on purpose, that this is a way that their mind seems to be coping with the disorder. They're not doing it intentionally. Our next one is illness anxiety disorder, which you probably recognize more as its former name, which was hypochondriasis. In this, there's a preoccupation with the idea that they have or that they might get a serious disease, along with a misinterpretation of their bodily systems or functions. So they may have a headache and interpret that as a brain tumor, have a stomach ache and think that they have some type of cancer. Three major characteristics. There's the physiological arousal, where they're worried, they can't sleep because they're worrying about these symptoms. A bodily focus, where they're extremely aware of any kind of sensations in their body and they're very preoccupied with physical complaints. And then the behaviors designed to avoid or check for physical illness. So they would avoid those who have a disease and engage in repeated self-inspection, or they would constantly go back to doctors thinking that they have some type of disorder. Some others disorders that fall under the somatic symptom disorder category, which really are not emphasized in our College Board curriculum, but you hear of, so I wanted to mention it here. There's Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen's by proxy. With Munchausen's, a person fakes an illness. They might lie about symptoms, even make themselves look sick or make themselves purposely unwell. A lot of times it's for the attention, but there's something else going on there. By proxy is when a caregiver does that to somebody else. They're causing an illness or injury in a person under his or her care. Sometimes it's to a child, an elderly person, or somebody who's disabled. These are called factitious disorders because they are skewing the facts involved there. Malingering is where a person might make up symptoms of the illness, either physical or mental, psychiatric symptoms, whereas we don't really have a clear cause, the other factitious disorders have more of a mental health condition. Malingerers are doing it more for a personal gain. They have external motivations. A lot of times it's monetary. They're trying to get insurance or some other kind of financial gain, trying to miss work, trying to show up at the hospital to get drugs. or prescriptions, trying to avoid obligations like with the military and other work, or maybe even trying to avoid prison time, malingering. All right, our next big category are the personality disorders. A lot of these can seem fairly similar, so I'm going to try to tell you key details with each. Of all of the personality disorders, and I think I've got 10 that we talk about here, the common symptom of all of them is that they're unable to establish meaningful relationships, that there's some element of their personality that makes it difficult for others want to have a relationship with them, whether that's a friendship, familial, family relationships, or romantic relationships. In the personality disorders, we've got a wide range of self defeating patterns from being painfully shy to being very vain and pushy. But in all of them, they're pretty inflexible. These symptoms have been long standing and they're maladaptive, meaning it makes it dysfunctional in how they deal with others. Personality disorders cannot be diagnosed in childhood. They've got to be 18 or older before they can officially be diagnosed as a personality disorder. We've got 3 clusters, and we'll talk about each of those in the upcoming slides. But in general, personality disorders can be pretty hard to treat because the people who have them are not usually distressed by the disorder. So it's usually at the insistence of others, often family or those who are attempting to have relationships with them, or court ordered before they'll actually get any treatment. Our first group of personality disorders are cluster A, and these are the odd or eccentric personality disorders. Our first is paranoid personality disorder. And like it sounds, the person is very paranoid. Pervasive, long-standing suspiciousness, generalized mistrust of others. They always feel like others are out to get them. They're talking about them, very suspicious of others. Schizoid is our next one. And this one, they just don't like other people. They're very cold. They're very indifferent to social relationships. They seem to have a limited range of emotional expression. Usually starts to show up by early adulthood, but it prevents them from having close relationships. And they don't want those close relationships. Schizotypal is kind of like a mild form of schizophrenia, but it's not actually schizophrenia. They have social and interpersonal difficulties, a lot of times just really described as kind of odd or eccentric behavior, unusual thoughts, strange kind of perceptions of reality. Like they're not truly having hallucinations and delusions like there would be in schizophrenia, but maybe they seem to have like an imaginary friend, or they think they have some kind of special skill or talent that others don't. They may have a distorted thinking, behave strangely, and they avoid intimacy. A little bit more about paranoid personality disorder. Again, they have this constant distrust and suspiciousness of others. They often think that they are being exploited or that other people are trying to deceive them. Their friends and their associates really aren't their friends. That if they try to tell somebody personal things about them, that it will be used against them. There's a hidden meaning in remarks, and often very untrusting in their personal relationships. Their partner or their spouse is unfaithful. So a lot of jealousy there. Our next cluster B exhibits dramatic or emotional traits. So these are very kind of loud personalities sometimes, or dramatic and emotional personalities. Our next one here is borderline personality disorder. And sometimes of all of these, probably maybe the hardest to diagnose. They have an ongoing pattern of varying moods. So a lot of times, borderline PD just seems like they're really moody. Their self-image and their behavior are inconsistent. Sometimes they can be impulsive in their relationships. I'll come back to the others. Sometimes they have these fears of abandonment, so they will cut people off. Like they'll be very loyal to people, but as soon as somebody wrongs them, they'll cut them off. Unstable interpersonal relationships, occasionally recurrent suicidal behaviors and threats of self-mutilation. Sometimes just these chronic feelings of emptiness, but then they can range to being anger, sometimes transient, meaning like occasional paranoia or dissociation. Sometimes can be described as a milder form of bipolar disorder. And again, it's hard to diagnose and get people to get treatment for these just because they're not distressed by them. Histrionic is a very loud, look at me, dramatic personality. Very excessive and attention seeking emotions. A lot of times they'll have a really loud laugh. They often wear clothing that's very attention seeking, whether it's a color or it's very sexualized. Sometimes they have this inappropriately seductive behavior or just this very excessive need for approval. Narcissistic can seem the same way, but it's a lot more quiet. That there's this attention seeking, but it's more of a need for admiration, and it's sort of this quiet expectation that others should know that I'm the best. So they have very exaggerated feelings of self importance. They lack empathy for others. Narcissism can be mixed up with antisocial personality disorder, but antisocial personality disorder usually takes it farther with more actions, rather, where narcissistic is more of these beliefs of self importance and this need for admiration. And so the antisocial personality disorder is also part of, I put cluster C, but it's part of cluster B. It is the most well-known personality disorder because it's the one that usually is linked to serial killers. Now, not everybody who has antisocial personality disorder is a serial killer, but very frequently those who are serial killers have APD. So they have a persistent disregard for and violation of others' rights, shallow emotions, and in some cases, no emotions at all. They seem to lack a conscience. Often don't conform to laws, repeatedly deceitful in their relationships with others, very impulsive. They tend to be irritable, and aggressive very easily, and they just really don't care about the personal safety of others. So like the other personality disorders, antisocial PD can't be diagnosed until about 18 years old, but the diagnosis says that they had to have been behaving this way since they were at least 15 years of age. So earlier on, they may have been diagnosed with a conduct disorder, which will be on an upcoming slide. Occurs more often in males than females. And a lot of times the APD is used synonymously with sociopath and psychopath. Now, so psychopath, sociopath is not really part of our AP curriculum, but everybody always asks about these. So including these very quickly here. Psychopaths and sociopaths do tend to pretend to have close relationships, but really they're faking it in a lot of cases because there's no true emotional connection. Psychopathy, they're both types of APD. Psychopathy is a more severe form of sociopathy. So while a sociopath may actually be able to experience emotions and relationships, a psychopath generally is not capable. And if they do have them, they tend to be faked. So psychopath, a more extreme version, they tend to be way more dishonest. Sociopath, a lot of the same symptoms, but they are still able to experience milder forms of emotions and relationships. As far as the causes of the antisocial personality disorders, some biological, possible in that maybe their autonomic nervous system is just low in arousal, so they're not very sensitive to punishment, and maybe an underdeveloped amygdala. But more often, people think that there are environmental factors involved, lack of good parenting models. But in other cases, the parents seem perfectly fine, but they still have these antisocial children. So it's not totally understood where it comes from. We talked earlier in the year about murderers and having that MAOA gene. PET scans of murderers have also showed that they have reduced activity in the frontal lobes. And remember, the frontal lobe has to do with decision making. Let's see. In childhood, it's not identified yet as antisocial personality disorder. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in another section. But they are often identified as conduct disorder, in which it's basically like antisocial personality disorder, but it's they're not old enough to have APD yet. And then oppositional defiant disorder, lots of anger, irritability, arguing towards the parents and other authority figures. So conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. Our last cluster is C, and they exhibit anxious or fearful behaviors. We've got avoidant personality disorder, which is kind of like schizoid in that they don't have social connections. They're extremely socially withdrawn. But the difference here is that they really wish that they could have social connections. That's kind of what's going on in my picture here, is wishing that he could connect with others. But they're very sensitive to negative criticism. They're basically painfully shy. Dependent personality disorder shows a lot like paranoid, but they're more inability to be alone. They need constant reassurance. They're kind of very clingy. They'd rather put others' needs before their own. And then obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, is where there's a preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and just interpersonal control, kind of like following the rules very strictly, inflexible, not very open, and they just want to do things exactly right. A lot of times when people describe themselves as OCD, really what they're describing more is OCPD. All right, that's all of them for flipped notes 8-3.